Hello again. In this video we're going to dive into the first three John Lennon solo albums. These are the experimental or avant-garde ones with Yoko Ono from 1968 and 1969. Two versions, Life with the Lions and The Wedding Album. A brief history of these three albums. They were all released while the Beatles were still together, all on Apple Records, which was the Beatles' new label. The idea of Apple was that it could release not only Beatles music, but whatever else the individual Beatles wanted to release. Could be their own experiments or up-and-coming artists, things like that. Of these three albums, the first one, Two Virgins, is by far the most well-known. And that's entirely because of the front cover, which is a real photograph of John and Yoko standing completely naked facing the camera. They took the picture themselves with a camera on a timer in a London flat at 34 Montague Square. Now this was a very famous flat. At the time it belonged to Ringo Starr. Paul McCartney had lived there in the mid-60s and Jimi Hendrix wrote The Wind Cries Mary when he was staying there in 1966. When John and Yoko's affair began in early 1968, his wife Cynthia and son Julian moved into the flat. But then they moved back and John and Yoko moved into the flat. 34 Montague Square was where John was busted for drugs during a raid in October 1968, a few weeks before Two Virgins was released. If those walls could talk. The full title of this album is Unfinished Music No. 1, Two Virgins. And the contents, well, it's basically like a 30-minute Revolution No. 9. But it's not as chaotic and busy as that piece. Two Virgins is quieter and more spaced out. There are slowed down backwards tapes of people speaking and warbling music and John mumbling or pounding on a piano and Yoko screaming. A lot of it is tape loops, and there was real work put into it, making the loops flow into one another and stuff. None of it is coherent or cohesive or understandable, but it's weird. It's like a journey, and you can get sucked into it. Now let me state for the record, by the way, that I do have more sympathy and patience for this sort of thing than a lot of people might. Arrhythmic, directionless, random noises is not what I listen to all the time, but I am open to it. I mean, all audio can be art, and avant-garde can work just like regular music. Now, Two Virgins was not recorded at Ringo's place at 34 Montague Square, but at the house John lived in with his wife Cynthia and son Julian. Now, those two had gone on vacation, so John, home alone, invited this intriguing artist, Yoko Ono, whom he'd met and been in touch with, over. By the way, back up a bit. Earlier that morning, which was May 19th, 1968, John had convened a meeting with the other Beatles to announce that, after a multi-day drug binge, he realized suddenly that he was Jesus Christ. So they all broke for lunch and it never came up again. It's become an infamous day in John's history. So that was the backdrop for Two Virgins. So that night, again on LSD, John and Yoko spent all night making these tape loops. John was operating multiple tape recorders and playing instruments, and Yoko just kind of sat and vocalized. The next morning they finally had sex, hence the album's title. At the time of recording, the relationship wasn't quite consummated yet. And then the story goes that Cynthia came home unexpectedly in the middle of all this. John and Yoko were there in the morning sitting around. Yoko was wearing one of her robes. Good times. Now the rest of 1968 was suitably chaotic. John and Cynthia got divorced. Yoko got pregnant, later had a miscarriage. John and Yoko started leasing Ringo's flat, as I mentioned. They spent the summer sitting around taking drugs and recording the White Album. And then they took the naked photos, front and back. Then John took the rap for the drug bust, and then the White Album was released to an enraptured music world, and finally Two Virgins was released to widespread shock and or bemusement. So, a lot of that is reflected in Life with the Lions, the second album, actually Unfinished Music Volume 2, Life with the Lions, which is very different than Two Virgins. So side 1 is a 26-minute piece that John and Yoko recorded live in front of an audience, actually in March 1969. The entire thing is Yoko screaming and wailing, and John making feedback on his guitar. In the last few minutes, a saxophone and drummer join in, and it's all very weird and noisy. Listening to the entire unbroken thing kind of cleans you out. It's real heavy. Side 2 of Life with the Lions has some really interesting shorter avant-garde pieces. They were all recorded in November 1968, while Yoko was in the hospital during her miscarriage, and John was staying with her. That's what's shown on the record cover. And, by the way, the back cover of Life with the Lions is taken the day after John's drug bust. So it's like an album as journalism and personal diary, and that was the point of John and Yoko's art in these final Beatle years. So on side 2 there are 4 pieces, and each of them are quite interesting. The first is called No Bed for Beatle John, which is John and Yoko spontaneously singing and chanting actual newspaper stories about themselves. The stories reference, among other things, Two Virgins and John's now ex-wife Cynthia. Interesting to hear gossip stories about celebrities read by the subjects themselves. Now track 2 is 5 minutes of audio of their baby's heartbeat in Yoko's womb. The miscarriage was on November 21st, 1968, the day before the White Album came out, incidentally. And these 5 minutes are the actual heart palpitations of the fetus, which was named John Ono Lennon II. As audio, it's just a monotonous, muffled thump, 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 thump. But knowing what it is gives it a very different, uncomfortable dimension. That's what I appreciate about the best parts of these albums. They stimulate the intellect in a way that most albums can't. Listening is one thing, but knowing what you're listening to makes it a whole other thing. So after that piece is a track called 2 Minutes of Silence, which is just that. I can't find any verification that the silence follows the baby heartbeat as a kind of memorial companion piece, but the effect is there anyway, even if it's just your own imagination or assumption. See, so now we are adding our own intellectual notions to the album. It fits in with John and Yoko's concept at this time that every human being is an art piece. So, for example, they put out this album, which is art from them, and then hearing it inspires different art thanks to the listener's own ideas. Very clever. The final piece on side 2 is 12 minutes long and it's called Radio Play, and I think it's the best avant-garde audio concept on this album. There are very short rhythmic blips of a real radio broadcast pulsing the entire time. You can tell when the music is playing or when the DJ is talking, but you can't really make anything out. The bursts are just too short. And behind that, for the whole 12 minutes, is just ambient sounds from the hospital room. So like John is on the phone with someone at first, and then he hangs up, and he and Yoko chat a little bit, but it just sounds like mumbling. I mean, it's not well recorded, it's just a microphone in the corner. And then it's mostly silence, like a chair creaking and the air conditioner running and things like that. I mean, maybe they're reading magazines or napping or whatever. So all you hear is these unremarkable sounds of daily life with the incessant blip, 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 blip on the radio. As far as audio art goes, it's really kind of cool. So the third and final John and Yoko experimental album is The Wedding Album. From a conceptual point of view, side 1 is again a very interesting idea. Side 2 documents their bed-in for peace in Amsterdam. So I like side 1. It's called John and Yoko, and it recalls baby's heartbeat. But this time, it's 22 minutes long, and it consists of John's heartbeat and Yoko's heartbeat, one in each speaker, while the two take turns saying each other's names over and over. John, Yoko, John, Yoko. Their voices go up and down, and sometimes they're anguished, and sometimes cute, and sometimes whispering, and the heartbeats throb the entire time. I listened to this one in headphones, as I did for all of these, and you really feel like you are pulsing through their veins after a while. The heartbeats and their voices just saying each other's names, it's very, very intimate. They released these albums as a way of being open and honest with the world to show themselves and what was going on. Well, mission accomplished. Now, side 2 of the Wedding Album was recorded in late March 1969, shortly after the live screaming and feedback performance from Life with the Lions. John and Yoko lay in bed for several days in a hotel in Amsterdam while people came in and interviewed them and stuff. So this is edited together audio clips of John and Yoko explaining themselves to the press, singing songs to each other and stuff like that. One interesting part, I thought this was very weird, was when Yoko tells a visitor that we should, quote, go back to the future, and a Michael J. Fox franchise was born. The Wedding Album, oddly, was released as a deluxe box with a big booklet and photos and drawings and a picture of a wedding cake and a copy of their marriage certificate, stuff like that. So, those are the 3 John and Yoko albums from 1968 and 1969. Far out, man. Really. By the way, one thing I've never really understood is when people criticize somebody for being self-indulgent. I think all music should be self-indulgent. I want to hear what the artists want to create. And that's certainly what John and Yoko did on these 3 albums. They put out something they wanted to put out. They knew they had a platform and they tried something new with it. I mean, the cover of 2 Virgins says it all. Here we are, nothing to hide. And here's what's going on in our lives. Complaining that it isn't enjoyable, like A Hard Day's Night or Yellow Submarine, it's not criticism, it's just kind of missing the point. And for context, remember that people always say the 60s moved fast. Well, remember that these albums came barely 3 years after the Beatles' Help. This same guy put these out. It was fast. Anyway, you might not listen to these albums a whole lot, maybe once a year, if that, if you're into this sort of thing at all. And John was as unique as they come, and this is what he chose to do. The albums do reflect their lives at this time, and their very existence sheds light on how the Beatles, John but also the others, were all striking off in their own directions. So I think Beatles fans should hear these at least once. Even for the longer, more monotonous pieces, try to stick it out to the end. They do have an effect. And they're all available, reissued with bonus tracks, if you can believe that. John Lennon's output went back to regular rock music after the wedding album, so the avant-garde fun pretty much stops here for him. But I'm glad these 3 albums exist. John wouldn't be John without them. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more Beatles solo album overviews, and I'll see you next time.